Okay.
Bene. Good evening and welcome to another appointment to this cycle of international video conferences dedicated to tramways and other means of transport. Tonight's presentation comes from England, and Charles Roberts from the Online Transport Archive will talk about tramways in the Mersey area. This is Liverpool and other cities nearby. This presentation will be done in English. At the end of the evening, there will be a space for any questions in English or in Italian, and you can also use the chat in English in every moment during the presentation. The complete program, someone asked me before, remember that the complete program of the forthcoming presentation is available on our internet site on the English section. Thank you. And now I repeat all in Italian before giving the floor to Charles. Buonasera, benvenuti a tutti a un altro appuntamento di questo ciclo internazionale di videoconferenze dedicate ai tram e agli altri mezzi di trasporto. Questa sera abbiamo dall'Inghilterra Charles Roberts della Online Transport Archive che ci parlerà dei tram nell'area della Mersey, cioè di Liverpool e delle città vicine. La presentazione sarà fatta in inglese, alla fine della serata ci sarà spazio per domande in inglese o in italiano, ma potete anche usare la chat quando volete in inglese durante la presentazione. Il programma completo delle prossime presentazioni è disponibile sul nostro sito internet come al solito. Prima di dare la parola a Charles, vedo che ci sono delle new entry, lo dico in inglese perché sono tutti stranieri. Before giving the floor to Charles, I just have to tell to the new entries that I see that there are 4 or 5 new people tonight. Please write your name, surname, and email address and city using the chat so we know who you are, and we will be able to send you invitations for all the forthcoming presentation in the future. Thank you. Okay, the floor goes to Charles Roberts. Please, Charles, go on.
Okay, thank you, Roberto. Hopefully you can hear me and everybody else can hear me. Buonasera. In primo luogo, non parlo italiano. That's all the Italian I know. Enough to say that I don't speak Italian. So I hope everybody understands me. Looking around the people arriving at the meeting, I see we have people from a lot of other countries other than Italy. So perhaps it was a good idea that I didn't try to learn Italian in the last week to deliver in that language. I see some very familiar names of people. Some of my colleagues from the society in the Merseyside area. Mark, Tony, Jonathan, Andrew, I think Ian's here as well. I noticed Alan Murray Rust. Happy birthday to Alan for 2 or 3 days ago. I can wish you that in public now. Hugh, I heard do an excellent talk on the tramways of the Newcastle area, the Tyneside area a few weeks ago. So hopefully mine can live up to what he did there. Paul over in North America, I noticed his name. He might not remember. We met on a street corner in Montreal. I noticed you had a Routemaster registration number plate behind you, so I've just gone and got that. Okay, so there's my little souvenir to compare with your slightly newer Routemaster one that you had behind. I noticed Rob Jones is there. It won't be the last time we see him this evening. I'll put that as a little spoiler alert. And I noticed Matthias, to show what a small international world it is these days. I'll be seeing Matthias in I think just over a week's time, won't I, in Germany? So very much looking forward to meeting up there. So to make a start, what I intend to do with the talk tonight is to talk for about an hour and a half. There won't be a break. Obviously, you're free to go out and take a break if you want to. But that's basically the agenda for tonight, which is consists of 8 tramways. So all of them we're going to deal with pretty quickly. But I also want to say a little about Online Transport Archive at the start, a little bit about Birkenhead's tram manufacturing industry, and down at the bottom, the preservation and heritage world in the local area as it relates to tramways. So if we make a start on the first section then, OTA, which some of you have heard about. In fact, I was just swapping messages with somebody in Romania on the side of the call. So clearly some of you, probably most of you, know about OTA. OTA has been around since 2000. It's an archive which, as it says on the screen there, preserves and conserves collections of photographs and moving images relating to all forms of transport. So road, rail, sea, air transport, both in the UK and overseas. We have some overseas collections, but we've also got a lot of collections of people who have travelled extensively overseas. So over the last 23 years, we've had a number of collections. I think it's about 200 now passed over to us. This was one from a chap called John Meredith in York, in England, who was downsizing from quite a big house and wanted a good home for his collection of negatives and prints and postcards. And he selected OTA, and we're making good use of John's material. We're based in a town called Shrewsbury in England, near the Welsh border. We were based at Hersham down in Surrey, courtesy of Ian Allen, but we had to move out of there when they sold the site and it became a supermarket. So that was not long before we moved from Shrewsbury, when some sorting had taken place. We get collections in a whole variety of different ways. Some are very, very well sorted. Others we have to almost go through every picture one by one to try and identify what they are and bring some sort of sortation to them. We make extensive use of these archive slide boxes, and we've got equivalent ones for prints and negatives as well. And these are very good, but both in terms of space that they take up, but also accessibility. If we do ever need to go back in and find a particular slide, it's a lot easier than having to go through little boxes of 10 or 20 slides that somebody might have kept them in their own collection. We keep everything that comes our way, but really a lot of it is now in reserve because a lot of our material has been digitized. So we work with Nikon and Epson scanners. We've had somebody down in Surrey who's been working with us, and he has done, I think, about 1 million scans. We haven't quite added it up yet, but about 1 million scans altogether. So that's the sort of level we're at now. And we are just beginning to look at the film collection digitization. I did notice again on the attendance list, Jim Harkins, whose house is Auchensugal Junction. So there's what are the chances of Auchensugal appearing on the screen tonight? But these are films by a chap called Jeff Todd, which Jeff died 2 or 3 years ago, and his family have funded some of the film transfers. So we're looking to a lot of that available in a variety of different ways. In terms of our public profile, we have a website, onlinetransportarchive.org. We also have a very active Facebook page. We normally put up 2 or 3 images a week. We put up some mysteries for people to have a go at, and a whole variety of different transport modes. That was one of our most popular pictures. We can't always predict which are going to be most popular, but a train and a ship and some classic British cars from the 1970s clocked up nearly 60,000 hits. So it was one of our most popular of the year. In fact, one of our most popular of all time. We produce a newsletter currently 3 times a year, which you can download from the website. But if you wanted to drop us an email, we could add you to the emailing list for that, which we have a number of feature articles, one of which I will be referring to as the evening goes on. But we also feature profiles of the collections and the people who've originated them. And one very, very important thing about OTA is that we're not a big anonymous archive. We do like to remember who has contributed those photographs to the hobby. And so we build up quite a big database of biographical detail and photographs of the individuals. And you will be seeing that in the talk tonight. I'll say a little bit by way of biographical information on some of the photographers. We've been involved with a lot of book writing over the last, well, probably 2007. So I think about the last 15, 16 years or so. And that's a selection of them. Again, another thing to stress is that OTA doesn't have paid staff, and the people who've written those books, and I noticed Jonathan Cadwallader is in the audience tonight. There he is up top centre. Was a co-author of Mersey Electrics. We don't, the authors don't get a fee for writing the book. All that money comes back into the archive. I say all that money, the rates are not as high as they were at one time, but any money that is raised from contracts for writing books is fed back into the archive to deal with our running expenses. And for the Italian audience, but also for others, that was quite a recent one that we did, May 2022. And it was through doing this book and some follow-up books which haven't yet appeared that we got put in touch with Roberto, and that's what has led to be doing this talk for you tonight. So very, very quick run there through OTA, and now to move on to the tramway systems themselves. And conscious that not everybody might know it, that's really what we're looking at. It's what we call Northwest England, which even that term sometimes confuses non-British people a little bit, because it looks as if it's in the centre of the country. But of course, we've got Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and the Republic of Ireland also shown on that map there. So the northwest of England, this area around the River Dee, the River Mersey, and going up to the River Ribble is generally speaking known as the northwest of England. So fairly compact area. You're probably talking about 40 kilometers from Chester in the south to Southport in the north. So quite a compact area of towns. And I've put that one in as well to try and put that into a slightly wider context. You can see Liverpool, Birkenhead and Wallasey in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen there. But what you've then got is the area going over to Manchester, up into East Lancashire in the top right-hand corner of the screen, and over to Blackpool in the top left-hand corner of the screen. And all those red dots were tramways. So going back to the 1920s and 30s, all those towns had tramways. All of them closed apart from one, which is Blackpool up in the north west corner in the top left of the screen, which of course has modernized in recent years, but does have a very strong heritage tramway. Manchester area tramways closed, but have been replaced from the early 90s onwards by Metrolink. And there is also a tentative plan to run trams in Preston as well. But that hasn't got anywhere so far, in spite of planning for the last 20 or 30 years or so. Well, one of the things I also want to do during the talk is to show the link between OTA and a lot of the research that's been done on these tramway systems, although it's largely been the other way round, because Bruce Maund, who is one of three people I'm going to thank at the start of the talk. Bruce was a transport historian. He was a transport professional, but in his for his hobby, he was a transport historian. Did some very, very in-depth research and published very, very widely. And after he died, we were passed his collection of prints by his two sons. Bruce was not a photographer himself, but he did collect photographs of the trams and buses of this area in the northwest of England. I remember talking to him, and he said very deliberately he concentrated his research on the northwest of England in detail, rather than spreading it around the whole country in a very, very superficial way. So quite a lot of the pictures tonight come from Bruce's collection. Quite a lot come from the collection of Curly Cross. Curly, who has been a very, very good supporter of OTA right from the start, as both a photographer and as a photograph collector, very, very early on passed his collection of black and white tramway and light railway photographs on to us, which it runs into the high tens of thousands, all immaculately catalogued and sorted. And to be honest, if we at OTA get an inquiry for an obscure tramway that closed in the 1930s, our first port of call is Curly's collection, and I would say 90% of the time, probably more than that, we find something in Curly's collection. And the third person to thank right at the start, Martin Jenkins, who has been involved with OTA. In fact, really, he was the brains behind the idea of OTA right at the start, and he himself is a photographer, filmmaker, and author and researcher. And as you can see there, he likes playing with his childhood toy trams as well. A picture from fairly recently. So I'll be providing more thanks to people as the talk goes on in very specific circumstances, but I wanted to get thanks to those three people. Obviously, Bruce no longer with us, but Curly and Martin are for the help they've given with this talk. So what I want to do for each of the systems is to start off with a bit of data about them, which I'll largely leave you to read on the screen. I did think when I produced these slides that perhaps the word municipalized might not be in the vocabulary of non-English speakers or non-English first language speakers. But it basically means taken over by the town or the city council. So the early tramways in the horse era were run by private companies in all of the towns that had them. In some of them, it continued into the electric era, but in others, the changeover from horse to council run came along with electrification. So Birkenhead is the first one that we're going to look at. I've got these maps that they're taken from a John Gillam, his legendary book on British tramway systems, and I've extracted them from there rather than show the detail of every point and every crossover. It just gives a feel for what the system was like. But Birkenhead was centred on Woodside, where there was a ferry terminal across to Liverpool, and the routes radiated out from there. Birkenhead is an industrial town on the Wirral Peninsula, active docks in its heyday, still some operational there today, and also shipbuilding, a very big shipyard in Birkenhead. But outside the central area, some quite what should we say, some quite sought after suburbs where the merchants and managers would have lived in quite big houses. And it's also home to a big municipal park, which we'll make reference to in a minute. Bruce and Martin collaborated over a book on the trams of Birkenhead and Wallasey. So anybody who wants to learn about the systems in detail, that's your port of call. The book has been out of print for many years, but copies are available on eBay and equivalent sites. But Birkenhead is a good place to start the talk because it was where trams started in Britain. Britain's first purpose-built street tramway in Britain in 1860 opened by George Francis Train, an American entrepreneur, an adventurer, supposedly the inspiration for Phileas Fogg in the book Around the World in 80 Days. And that is purported to be him standing on the upper saloon of that horse car in 1860, holding his arm out. And this was the very first street tramway in Britain that we would recognise it today. The early cars, and I should perhaps say, I'm not going to go through every type of car that was operated, and particularly in the horse tram era, but even in the electric era. I'm more trying to give a flavour for the sort of trams that were operated, but also to show one or two remnants of vehicles and infrastructure that survive today. But the early cars on the Birkenhead horse tramway system, there were several different companies in the early days, but the early trams were American design and assembled in Britain, in Birkenhead, in fact, from kits. And that's really how Birkenhead, for quite a number of years, for what, probably about 40 years, was one of the leading centres for tramcar construction in Britain. So there's car number 18, locally built by Milnes in 1887, that particular one, with the two horses seen at the terminus of one of the routes. Another company, another horse tram. This is down in New Ferry by one of the depots, a site that was subsequently used for a bus depot, but is not used for transport purposes today. But the general road layout is actually recognisable. I think those buildings in the background, which are shops, I think those are still there today. The first electric trams appeared in 1901, replacing the horse trams, and number 10 is an early single decker, one of 13 that were bought to start the system with, and this was built by Milnes in Birkenhead in 1901. So a typical Milnes single decker of that era. Quickly moved on to double deckers. Number 31 again built by Milnes, and that was there for the start of the system in 1901, and shown in its original condition. We'll see quite a few themes coming through, but one of those themes is the construction of open top trams to start with, but very, very quickly, in fact, in some cases, even within a year, the construction of top covers to convert the trams to full double deck without the open top. So that's car number 31. Number 21, the same type. In fact, you can see that a little bit later. So, but this has had the enclosed upper deck, the enclosed top cover, and that's shown on Park Road North in Birkenhead. And the on the right-hand side is Birkenhead Park, which is claimed to be the first publicly funded civic park in the world. And an application has just gone in for UNESCO World Heritage status for Birkenhead Park. If you go to Birkenhead Park and read the information boards, they tell you that Central Park in New York is based on Birkenhead Park, when I went to Central Park in New York, I desperately looked for any reference to Birkenhead, but surprise, surprise, it doesn't get there mentioned at all. But do note in that picture the ornate centre poles that the Birkenhead tramway was festooned with these poles. We will see another couple of examples of those as the talk goes on. Birkenhead Woodside was the hub of the system. The building behind is still there, the ferry terminal, but the terminus arrangement for the tramway, supposedly unique in Britain, where you had this fan of 6 parallel tracks. And you can also see that the final pole has got a big span on it that covers all 6 tracks. So both of those things were unique in Britain. And it was for many, many years a big transport hub, this, trams, later buses, ferries, and a railway station alongside it as well. Still recognisable today, but a shadow of its former self. Another picture taken at Woodside with one of the subsequent buses. The trams and the early buses were in a dark maroon colour, which you'll see a bit later, but the buses later became blue, which is what I remember from my childhood. And the building behind is part of Woodside Station, which until 1967 had through services to London Paddington Station via Chester. A slightly later bogie car that in 1902 they got 15 bogie cars, again built locally, known as Preston bogie cars. So you can see number 53 there, and these were new in 1902. And the final new cars that arrived for the Birkenhead system were in 1913, not built locally. They were built by Hurst Nelson in Motherwell, and that's one of the 6 bogie cars that was introduced in 1913. So these ran from number 63 to 68. 68 was the highest numbered tram in Birkenhead, which we'll make reference to a little bit later on. The system closed in 1937. So apart from Liverpool, which is very much an exception to the rule, Birkenhead was the last one of these tramway systems in the area. We see again some quite similar themes with what happened to the trams. A lot of the tram bodies, wooden tram bodies, made good sheds, waiting shelters, all sorts of different things. And that's a body off one of the bogie cars. If you look in detail at the lower panels there, you can just about make out it says Birkenhead Corporation Tramways. When I first started taking interest in tramways, which I was probably about 17 or 18 at the time, I was always fascinated by this idea of relics of tram bodies, and discovered that these were within about a mile and a half of where I lived at the time. So as soon as I read that, got my camera out, went to see them, to only discover that they'd been dismantled about 2 weeks before. So I never got to see these. The people in the know were well aware of these, and there were some moves to preserve them. But as often happens, things happen quickly when councils are involved, and they were broken up and burned, and there were just a few piles of concrete left there to remind you of where it was. And that's what I found in the late 70s. A lot of tram track was simply buried and covered over by tar macadam, and still today it reappears every time there are roadworks in certain parts of the town that we're showing here. That picture itself is probably nearly 50 years old in Rock Ferry in Birkenhead, but you can see there they're resurfacing the road, stripped off the top layer of tar macadam and what's underneath but the stone sets and the tram tracks visible within it. Again, relics that survived. A lot of the tram poles survived for a time, and that's a lineup, a very impressive lineup in Cleveland Street, which we'll come on to talk about Cleveland Street in a few minutes' time. And one of our contributors to OTA, Alan Clayton, he approached the council and was promised these tram poles. But of course, again, they just sort of disappeared one night and were replaced by modern ones. There is a rumor that some of the bases were acquired by an enthusiast, but they've never come to light as far as I'm aware. So that's another relic that has disappeared. You can still today find a few odd relics. In Birkenhead, this is the only one. You might be wondering why I'm showing that picture, because it's a bus. But if you look in the top left of the picture on the wall, there is a rosette which connected the span wire of the tramway overhead from one side of the road to the other, where there were no tram poles, no trolley poles. I'm told it's the only one in Birkenhead. There are a few more in other towns and cities, but that is the last surviving tram rosette in Birkenhead on Conway Street, on a former school building that was subsequently used as offices. One of the horse tram depots survived until 2005. And then the land was sold and houses were built on it. There is the sad sight of the shed, but you can see the back wall of the shed was still in situ right until the end. But thankfully, somebody did get wind of it quickly enough, and that has been restored and is in the Tramway Museum down at Birkenhead, which we're going to mention towards the end of the talk. So you can see the Birkenhead Tramway Company, one of the predecessors to the corporation tramways. And the main corporation tram shed did survive until 2002. It's that shed in the background with the not particularly attractive shed, not a great architectural loss. But that site was cleared as to give open parking for the local bus company. But creditably, they have retained the office building. They hadn't used it for many years, but as part of the redevelopment in 2002, they've kept the office building, complete with the municipal crest. And 1903, from when it was opened officially, although the trams had been running a couple of years before, and in front of above the main door, it still says tramway offices, as you can see there. And if you go outside, every now and again, the track keeps reappearing. So as the tarmac wears away, that's one of the former entrances. Obviously now is fenced off, but you can see two of the stretches of track going into the depot, which they keep tarmacking over them, and every 10 years or so they keep reappearing. So that was just taken a few weeks ago. So that's really Birkenhead. Other than just to say that's one other interesting thing in Birkenhead. You remember the picture, which I've repeated there, top right, of George Francis Train on the original tram. The building in the background still exists and now has a red plaque, a Transport Trust red plaque, to mark the first passenger street tramway in Birkenhead. So moving on to tram manufacture, before we go back to the systems themselves, I did mention before that the early trams that Birkenhead had were actually assembled in the town, and that led to an extended period during which a lot of tram construction took place in Birkenhead. The expert here is in the audience, and that's Rob Jones. Rob has written a book on the subject, 1859 to 1913, from start to finish, extensively researched it, all the people involved, all their families, and trams, and the orders that were placed for them. And Rob very, very generously, I mentioned I was doing this talk, this is probably about 6 months ago, and I said I'd be very grateful for any material he was able to let me have to illustrate this talk. And he gave me his presentations, his PowerPoint presentation. So I have taken a few pictures here, but it's a very, very truncated form. And I feel a bit embarrassed about presenting this when we do have the real expert in the audience. But there were a number of companies in succession, but all with connections to each other, so a sort of succession of companies. Robert Main was the first one, and he was the one who was assembled early cars for George Francis Train, and also built some tram cars for London. So that was 1859 to 1862. The next company was that of Elijah Prentice, who was another American, and the connection there was that he was also George Francis Train's father-in-law. And they, as well as building trams for Britain, built them for places like Buenos Aires, Copenhagen, and this is a Geneva tram from the early 1860s. Starbuck is perhaps a more familiar name. He was another American, and set up a partnership with Prentice. Although Rob in his book said there are one or two mysteries still to be sorted out. So two companies successfully, George Starbuck and Company and the Starbuck Car and Wagon Company, for about 20 years. They built horse cars for places like Ryde on the Isle of Wight, Douglas on the Isle of Man, Brussels, Liège, Porto, and were also in the early electric era with some of the very first cars for Blackpool. Starbuck does seem to have been a little bit of a fraud. He went bankrupt several times over. I think Rob in his book said he was very well acquainted with the workings of the British bankruptcy courts and the bankruptcy law, but nevertheless operated for 20 years. Milnes was George F. Milnes, and I need to be quite specific about that. He was the company secretary for Starbuck, and so when the Starbuck company went into liquidation, George F. Milnes bought it and ran it under his own name until 1908. Both in Birkenhead, but he did also establish another factory at Hadley in Shropshire. So a lot of the cars around, the Milnes cars around, were not actually built in Birkenhead. They were built in Hadley. This one was built in Birkenhead, and that's for the Kimberley and Beaconsfield tramway in South Africa. But they also built for places like, and I should have said, actually, it's a battery tram, very early electric vehicle. It's a battery tram rather than a horse one. But Isle of Man, Bristol, Leeds, Halifax in Britain, badged under the Milnes name. And the final company in Britain, in Birkenhead, was Milnes Voss. And you will see there it's GC Milnes, not GF Milnes. And that was actually GF Milnes' son. And he paired up with the Voss company, Thomas Voss, and built about 120 trams. The one that's shown there was built for Leighton in London, one of 40 that they built for those. But they also specialised in building top covers for trams. So often another manufacturer's tram would have a Milnes Voss upper deck to modernise it rather than having a full open deck configuration. There's quite a lot of the heritage of that still survives. That was Cleveland Street, where we saw the tram poles before. That was the Starbuck factory, which later became the GF Milnes Works. And there is another plaque on the wall there to mark that historical precedent. So under both names of the company. That's the building next door. Again, was used for trams, and I was very pleased to manage to persuade Rob, for a few of us, to do a walking tour around this part of Birkenhead. So there's Rob standing outside the factory, holding a picture of one of the trams that was built there, and standing almost in exactly where that tram was. The picture we're looking at there is quite a curious one. It was a trailer car built for a tramway called the Plynlimmon and Havant tramway in Wales. It was 686 millimeters, which is 2 foot 3 inches. And it opened in 1897. It closed in 1899, so it only ran for just over 2 years. But what Rob points out is basically what they've done is they've built the tram inside the shed. They've waited for the horse trams to pass and just wheeled it out, sort of bounced it out on its flanges across the road, posed it for a photograph, and then presumably bounced it back in again to finish off work. You can see it's horse tram. You'd have thought taking an official photographer, photograph, you would have cleared some of the horse deposits off the road, but it doesn't look as if they have done for that. So I'm not too sure that the Plynlimmon and Havant tramway would have been too pleased to see horse manure on their official photograph. That's around the back of the building. That's Rob again holding up a picture of a Liverpool horse car. Outside the building, this Liverpool horse car was posed outside for the official photographer. So the building is still there. These were just taken probably 3 or 4 years ago. And the Milnes Vos, the front of the building is still there, a little bit further down Cleveland Street. Some of the construction area has now gone. That's the only picture I've got of it. As you can see, it's taken from my dash cam. I drove in with somebody, but didn't really have time to stop. And I thought, well, I'll go back sometime and have another look at it. Last time I looked, that part of the building has been demolished for housing. Rather nice E-type Jaguar there being worked on, as you can see on the left of the picture. In the early 1970s, it was a lot more interesting because a couple of people, Martin Jenkins and Jerome McWatt, which is another name I'll mention a little bit later on, they went there and found that inside, which is believed to be a top cover, i.e. upper deck of a tram that was built for a customer but never delivered. And it stayed there well into the 1970s. Oh, sorry. There's another picture from the other angle. Martin's description to me yesterday, he said in its later life, it was used to house a very unpleasant dog. So that they were taking their life into their hands somewhat with this dog potentially coming out and biting them. But they got those 2 photographs, but sadly that looks as if it disappeared. Nobody knows what happened to it, but it was probably just broken up when the building was cleared for other use. And 2 final things. We had the pre-view of that one, but elsewhere in Birkenhead, not quite within walking distance, but Rob took us to see the gravestones of George Starbuck, and a short distance away from it, the gravestone of George Frederick Milnes, the father rather than the son. And recently, a new plaque has been put there to show the linkage between George F. Milnes and the tramway industry. Okay, so that's Birkenhead's tram building industry. Let's go back to the tramways themselves. Wallasey is the next one, a residential town largely, some lighter industry, but 3 ferry crossings in its heyday across to Liverpool, which a lot of the population, the working population, used to do. It had 4 routes, but they basically all connected the same 2 places. part of Wallasey is called Wallasey, but it slightly confuses people that there are several other towns within a town, particularly New Brighton and Seacombe. So all of the 4 tram routes connected New Brighton and Seacombe, but went via other routes. We've introduced the book already that covers the 2 systems, and you can get some idea. I should perhaps point out, you can get some idea of the liveries from the pictures on the cover there. So Birkenhead, this dark maroon, and this odd colour of Wallasey that was known as sea green. So sort of very, very light green, which in bus days virtually became yellow. Company horse trams early on. That's the Wallasey United Tram and Omnibus Company, again built by Milnes, 1893. The electric service was introduced in 1902, inaugurated in 1902, and the first 25 trams were built in Preston, a succession of companies there, in what probably was the biggest tramway manufacturing town in Britain at the time. But there's number 8, one of the first 25 electric cars in original condition with its open top. New Brighton was in its heyday a very popular day trip resort. Ferries would come over from Liverpool with, anything up to about 1,000 people on board. And there's some very, very busy crowds in the early years of the century, by which time the trams had received top covers. And you can see the routes on those. All of the trams are going to Seacombe, but S is going via Seabank Road, WD is going via Warren Drive. So the 4 routes were all lettered and connected the same places, but went via different routes. P was Poulton. So that was a later route, and that's also on the P, and St Hilary's Church, a very dominant feature on the skyline still today for Wallasey. The later trams were built by Brush. So there's a couple of the Brush cars, 37 of them built over a 10-year period, and that's at the tram depot at Seaview Road, which was opened at the start of the electric system in 1902. And you can see there the route letters on the depot building. RL is Rate Lane, so that was another one of the routes. So as the trams were parked overnight and ready to run out in the morning, they were all allocated to their particular routes. So 52, which we'll see in a while, and 65 were 2 from that order. 78, which again we'll see a little bit later on, was the highest numbered one. So that was delivered from Brush in 1920. Trams only lasted till 1933. Again, many of the tram bodies put to other use. That's one of the bodies in use as a waiting shelter in Moreton, and you can see there, so it's either fallen off or somebody's prized off one of the wooden slats, so you can see the yellow sea green livery underneath, and you can just presumably make out the word the R out of the word tramway at the end of it. But lots of the tram bodies went out into North Wales, and in the late 60s, early 70s, there were quite a few expeditions of early preservationists who went out there to do an inventory of what tram bodies were around. And so the stories go, but people would go to one farm, have a look at a tram body, only to be told, well, of course, there's another one on the next farm. And altogether, they identified, I think 12 or 15 tram bodies. So there were the first 3, and there's another 3 there. And you can see the one in the top right, you can just about see in the window, has still got the municipal coat of arms. So a lot of the period detail was still there. OTA is a photo archive rather than a document archive, but we do have this document from Jerome Watt, who was one of the early preservationists and also a photographer. We're hoping to get an article out of that. The only thing is we've got to try and understand his handwriting. But that's the detail of all the tram bodies and what could be done with them to make a good tram. But more of that towards the end of the tour. Tram tracks buried in the street in Wallasey as well. An early horse bus depot survived into the until at least 1988. That's actually one of my photographs, but it was demolished not long afterwards. I never got into it. That's somebody else's picture, but it still had the horse tram track in right until it was until the day it was demolished. Seaview Road depot was used for buses until 1986. It was then demolished, and like a lot of these sort of premises, it was sold for use as a supermarket. And a very recent picture here. A few weeks ago, beginning of April, there was an event to mark. It should have been the 100th anniversary of buses in Wallasey. It was actually the 103rd, and as part of it, because the supermarket was closed for Easter Sunday, these buses were all lined up there, and you can see 3 there in the later version of the Wallasey sea green livery. And so a nice event, nice way of marking the buses. I did say that this is a little bit of an aside here, really. I did say there were 78 trams. So how come I've got number 79 on the screen? Well, there are 2 claimants to tram 79. One is a pub in New Brighton, going via the Warren Drive route. The person who's done that has obviously gone to some trouble. And I remember Rob saying he did go to the tram museum to get the colour specification absolutely right. And there we've got another claimant to tram 79 for the children to have a ride on at the Transport Museum in Birkenhead. But the real tram system just got up to number 78. Chester is, technically not part of Merseyside. I should have said at the start of the talk, there's all sorts of definitions of what is Merseyside, but it was only for a relatively short time there was a council body called Merseyside, but it's generally taken to be places on or around the mouth of the Mersey. Chester is actually on the River Dee, so it's a little bit away from that, but I've included it here as well because there are 1 or 2 linkages. There's the detailed early horse tram, actually built to a different gauge. When they went electric, they re-gauged it to 914 millimeters, having been standard gauge before that. And a relatively short network from Saltney right up on the Welsh border. In fact, that dotted line on the extreme left of the picture there is the Welsh border, through the historic city centre. Chester was a Roman city. There was a lot of medieval buildings and a city wall built round it, which has always caused problems for the transport people. But Saltney out to the Crystalton area in the east, but a spur down to the railway station where the depot was. There's a good book, again, been long since out of print, by David Clark, who was the general manager of the bus company, and Harry Dibdin, who will introduce Harry in a couple of minutes' time. But again, that book probably came out, 40 years ago, and has long since been out of print. Number 4 was one of the cars new in 1879 to inaugurate the service. Normally ran with a single horse, but on some of the hillier parts of the route, they had a second trace horse, which provided a bit of extra propulsion on the hillier sections. Electrification in 1902 with trams coming from Milnes. And you can see here, that scene has not changed that much, really. The buildings, these half-timbered buildings, are still there. The Eastgate clock in the background is very much a symbol of Chester even today. And it was recognised as a historic city at the time. And the quality of that picture is wonderful, and it's one that comes from Francis Frith. And in our newsletter, which you can access via the website, we've featured an article on these three people. I've mentioned Martin Jenkins a few times. Jerome McWatt, who was the one who did the survey of the Wallasey bodies, and again somebody else you might recognise, some of you, David Packer, got wind of the fact that Friths were getting rid of their plate glass negatives, which they were just going to smash and sell the glass for recycling in the very early 1970s. So these three enthusiasts rescued probably about 200 or 300 of these negatives, and those have now come to OTA. So we tell that article in that story and that article in our newsletter. I was checking the detail of David Packer. I didn't have a date of birth for him. He was actually born on the 17th of July 1937, and he's never forgiven his mother for not taking him for a ride on a Birkenhead tram on the very day that the tramway system closed. But here's a few more. Frith, you can see a much better view there of the Eastgate clock, which, as I say, is still there. That's car number 3 in the historic city centre. Another car in Bridge Street, what they call the Rows, which are these twin-level shopping streets, which Chester is very, very well known for. On the route out to Saltney, that's car number 7. Across the River Dee from the main part of Chester. Number 9, outside the railway station, which is quite similar today. The big station frontage remains there today and is still a terminus for some bus routes. But that was the only single deck car built by Brush in 1906, and that's filmed in photographed in the depot. So that's car number 13. And Chester's trams closed 1930, so one of the earlier closures of the tramway systems that we're looking at today. And as with the other ones, tram bodies were nice garden sheds. And the body off electric car number 4 was sold to a Mr. Edwin Dibdin, who lived in a village south of Chester. And he was a coach builder by trade. So rather than just paddling over the windows as many people did, he actually kept it in relatively authentic condition, in the livery, this light green and cream, with all the quarter light adverts in it and the varnish panels inside. And if you think you recognise the name Dibdin, well, his son Harry inherited the house and inherited the car body from him. And so that's a picture of Harry Dibdin sitting in this tram car in, I would guess, probably the early 1970s. And the picture is taken by Dennis Gill, and that's another recent photograph we've had. One of the two of you might recognise the name Dennis Gill, again as a photographer and an author on tramway subjects. And he sadly died in the autumn, but his family have passed his collection of slides and negatives on to us. So again, it won't be the last time we see that Chester tram in the talk tonight. The tram depot was converted for buses and never changed until it closed in that role in just let me find my notes here. So I've until 2010. So still until 2010, you had this. By this time, it has to be said, quite ramshackle bus depot with tram track at the front and at the back of it. The bus company was sold, and the depot closed and the depot site cleared. But quite creditably, the building, although the building has disappeared, it's now student accommodation. You've got tram track and the depot fan at the back of the site. And at the front of the site, you've still got the tram track coming out of it. You can see the student accommodation is actually called Tramways. And there's somebody checking what gauge their car is, comparing it with the 3-foot gauge tramway. I don't know whose car it is. Initial CCR by the looks of it. Warrington, the next one, going a little bit northwest from Chester. Unusually, in two respects. One is it didn't have any predecessor to the electric tram. Secondly, it was always municipal rather than being run by private companies. So 1902 to 1935, and electric tramway start to finish and run by the corporation. Variety of different routes going off in different directions from the centre. Centre is actually on the River Mersey. The River Mersey, albeit much narrower at this point, goes through the centre of Warrington. This is the bridge, now one of the bridges over the River Mersey in the centre of Warrington. A few of the cars that they're operating, again with top covers. These were built by Milnes, the very early ones, and there were then a further 6 cars built by, that's another one of the Mills ones, but there were a further 6 cars built by Brush in 1919, number 27 to number 22 to 27. 27 was the highest numbered tram, and again there's a reference to that a little bit later on. So a few more pictures here in the centre of Warrington. One thing that there isn't about Warrington, there's no definitive history book about them. There's been a few articles, but unlike all the other systems, there isn't a definitive book on the subject, so I can't give a shout out to the author there. And there, at one of the extremities, the system, car number 4, one of the earliest cars, by this time complete with top cover and with enclosed vestibules. The tramway only lasted 33 years, closed in 35. I always thought there were no remains of it at all. I'd asked about it, and then I was in Warrington a few months ago and noticed that on one of the buildings. So there is one rosette. If anybody knows of any others, then let me know. I'd be interested to see it. But that one is on one of the main streets in Warrington. There is another connection with the tramway, though, in the present day, because it's one of the few towns in Britain that still has a council-owned bus company, and they quite proudly say, although they run in a modern livery and with modern branding, they do show their heritage back to 1902 and the start of the tramway. So they're keen to stress that they are part of the local council ownership. And there's now only something like about, I think it's about 7 or 8 such companies in the whole of Great Britain, but Warrington is one of those. St Helens, quite a complicated story here, which I've by definition got to go through fairly quickly. They had horse trams, followed by steam, followed by electric, all run by companies, and it didn't become a municipal company until 1919. One of the other things that was unusual about it is it actually had a physical linkage to other systems. So at Haydock in the northeast there, it connected onto a company system in South Lancashire. And at Prescott in the southwest of the St Helens area, it connected to first of all an independent company, but they were then taken over by Liverpool Corporation. So you had connections and fairly short-lived through services. Bruce Maughan, who we've seen before, he worked with Mervyn Ashton, who was co-author of that book with him. But we have Bruce's collection of photographs of the various different eras, because there's actually a little bit more to it after the tram was finished. So there's one of the horse trams with 3 horses in front of it there. It's an Eads car, so one of these where the tram body rotates on the chassis on the truck, so that you didn't have to keep taking the horses off at each end. But with 3 horses, probably 2 horses, and then an additional trace horse to provide additional propulsion. Steam trams for 10 years, 1890 to 1900. The bogie trailer behind was built by Milnes in Birkenhead, and I'm sure we've got people with far greater expertise than I have, but the trucks on that look very much like some of those on the Manx Electric Railway, where those were coming from Birkenhead round about the same time. Electric cars from 1899. So number 5 was one of 16 cars from Brush to the St Helens Company. So it was a company at this time, not the corporation. And number 34 was one of an additional 20 bogie cars. And this is seen in a place called Knotty Ash, which is nowadays part of Liverpool, but at this stage was part of the independent Prescott tramway. And this was actually at the city boundary in those days. So at that stage, it was the limit of tram operation out to the west of St Helens. Prescott, still quite a busy little town in its own right. So a couple of pictures here in Prescott. Some of these buildings are still there, but the road has been widened quite a bit over the years. And although that road junction is still there, the building behind isn't. What you've got there is a St Helens tram on the left, but a Liverpool one, number 147 on the right, running through to the terminus at Pier Head. So Route 10 was the Liverpool Corporation tramway number, and is still the bus number today. We'll make reference to that in one of the later pictures. Car number 14 was a Preston-built car, which St Helens actually got second-hand from Wigan. So it was new 1904 and bought second-hand from Wigan in 1927. And when the trams finished in St Helens, it's the only town that we're showing here tonight that replaces trams with trolley buses. So that's at the Nutgrove turning loop on the trolley bus system in the overlap period between trolley buses and trams. But notice that the trolley bus has St Helens Corporation Tramways as the fleet name on it, so they retained that into the early trolley bus days. A little bit of a mystery here. I was given that picture, which is claimed to be a St Helens tram body at a bus route terminus in St Helens, but nobody can actually tell me precisely where it was. It was only taken in the 1980s, or indeed what has happened to it since then. If I knew where it was, I could go and have a look for it. I suspect it's probably not there, but whether it's disappeared altogether or whether it's one of these that's been rescued to build a tram, perhaps somebody could let me know. The electric tram depot itself survives, but has been much modified over the years, so it doesn't have quite the character of some of the structures that we're looking at. And it was still a bus depot until the early 1980s, but has now become a transport museum. Well worth a visit if you're in the northwest of England. And inside, there's still evidence of it having been a tram depot. Southport. So we're going up now to the Irish Sea coast. Southport is a perhaps rather genteel dormitory town and tourist town is probably the best way to describe it. They certainly don't like being grouped in with Merseyside. It's always been an objection to theirs. And actually, if you look at Merseyside County, which existed in the 70s and 80s, the borders were drawn in a very strange way to include Southport in it. So don't try going to Southport and telling them they're Merseysiders, because they won't appreciate that. Horse tramway followed by electric. But as you'll see, two different dates for municipalisation. In the electric tramway era, you actually had parts of the town served by the company, part of the town served by the corporation. There's an author on books, so I'll introduce on the next slide, and I'm quoting these two things from his book, Two Claims. One is it had the greatest length of tramway in proportion to its population than any town in the kingdom, as in the whole of the UK. And from a railway point of view, more route miles of railway and more stations than any town of its size. When you actually look at that map, the distance from Botanic Gardens to Birkdale is only about 6 kilometres. But you had this relatively dense network of lines. And as I say, at one time, there were 3 different companies operating different parts of that network. The quote comes from Cedric Greenwood, who has co-authored this book on Southport trams. To be fair, it might be his co-author's name. As I understand it with this book, James Dean, not that one, wrote the most of the manuscript, but he died, and Cedric brought it to fruition and had it published. And Cedric is somebody who we work with at OTA. I was speaking to him just a few days ago about an American interurban tram book, which he's working on at the moment and using quite a lot of OTA material with it. I think these are Francis. Yes, in fact, that does have Francis Frith's code on. There's a horse tram on Lord Street, this quite elegant boulevard that runs down the centre of Southport. Relatively unchanged to today, although a lot of the shops are now closed. So that's a horse tram of the Southport Tramways Company. That's another horse tram looking off Lord Street, and that's the Birkdale and Southport Tramways Company. So those two operated to two different parts of the town. And the Birkdale company was integrated into Southport, or Birkdale Council was integrated into Southport. You had an overlap period where the 3 tramways existed, but after the horse trams finished, you had the company trams and the corporation trams, and that picture, which I think comes from Curly Cross's collection, shows one of each. That one, which is number 7, is the company car, a 1901 brush car, and that was their unique single decker, which is purported to be one of the first one-man operated cars. So the fare was 1 penny, and you put that into a slot as you got on. So there was no conductor to collect fares. The corporation had some of these California type cars with open sections at the end and an enclosed section in the centre. And the corporation bought some double-deck electric cars from Dick Kerr in Preston in 1901. So that was the sort of typical double-deck car in Southport in a red and cream livery, which was then perpetuated for the buses into the here in the 1920s and 30s, but the buses were still there until the early 1970s in the red and cream livery. And the distinction very quickly disappeared. The company was merged into the corporation in 1918, and the trams were successively rebuilt. So that one, number 13, I must admit, it doesn't look like number 13, but every time I've seen this picture published, and it has been published several times, refers to it as number 13, is a car that started life with the company, but then was rebuilt 2 or 3 times over by the corporation and was virtually indistinguishable. The corporation also had some toast rack cars for running tours for the day trippers and other holiday makers to the town. There's number 23. I think that's number 31. They had 6 of these. They had a grand tour and a circular tour round town. and they had one single decker, number 45, which was originally one of the California cars with the open areas at the end, but was rebuilt to a fully enclosed car. Again, another example of a tram body being used, this time as a garden shelter. A tram that wasn't preserved, but one that became was used for parts for a restored Stockport tramway, so outside our area, but it was it went to a good home, even though it wasn't actually preserved itself. A few odd little bits of infrastructure. The company electric depot survived until the 1990s, and even though it had a preservation order on it, it was demolished. But the developers did condescend to make this block of exclusive apartments look like a tram depot. I'm not sure that the owners of the flats necessarily really appreciate that, but some of the brickwork was apparently reused. Nearby, there's a waiting shelter. I was talking to somebody over the weekend who said that it's now used as a storeroom for gardening equipment. So for quite a historic building, it's not really being particularly well looked after. But possibly the jewel in the crown, not just of Southport, but of all the remaining transport infrastructure bits, is the depot, originally called Crowlands, now known as Canning Road, which was after the trams finished, was converted for bus use and is still in use as that today with Arriva. There's always worry about bus companies moving to sites and selling off their sites. As far as I'm aware, there is no preservation order on that building, which would be a real shame if that was to disappear after well over 100 years. The amount of detail that went into designing that building. A few other odd little bits about Southport. There was a short freight tramway, actually at the back of the tram depot and bus depot, which used these steeple cab electric locos. I think they had two of these, and they ran from 1920. I think they used some withdrawn tram parts, and were used for shunting coal round at the gasworks. The electric side of it closed in 1940. The line was actually strangely converted to steam locomotive operation after that. But for that 20-year period, it had these electric steeple cab locos running on it. Southport had a pier tramway as well. Over the years, the beach has silted up, and the actual sea has got further and further away. So although it purports to be a seaside town, an awful lot of people go to Southport and never see the sea. But the pier opened in 1859, the tramway 1863. Went through several different generations of rolling stock. So a few of those here. And the last one was a battery tram, which was built in 2005, last ran in 2015, and then in the dead of night in March 2016, it disappeared, presumably for scrap. And the tram rails were still there in the pier last year, but I'm told have subsequently gone. There's all sorts of other proposed lines. Every system we've looked at has had proposals to extend them. The only one I've put in here is this really strange one, where it was proposed to connect Southport with Lytham over the Ribble estuary by means of a transporter bridge that would have carried the trams across. This was the early years of the 20th century, and those proposals were never followed through. So that's something that only exists as an artist's illustration, and that's early LRTL book. booklet by Norman Forbes, who was a photographer. His photographs are now at the Christ Tramway Museum, but Norman was a very, very well-travelled and prolific photographer whose pictures are well used in many, many publications. Smaller to the systems that we're looking at, you come south down the Irish Sea and into the mouth of the River Mersey. The Waterloo and Great Crosby Tramway, very, very short-lived, 1900, 1925, electric from start to finish, and was never taken over by a municipality, although there was a proposal that it would have been taken over by Liverpool Corporation, but it never actually took place. It was part of the Liverpool Overhead Railway Company. So the Liverpool Overhead Railway, an elevated railway that ran from Seaforth in the north. You can see it in brown, shown towards the bottom left of that map. I've picked brown because that was the livery of the Liverpool Overhead Railway, varnished and then later painted brown. The tramway, the Waterloo and Great Crosby Tramway, in a green livery, ran 4 kilometres north of there to Crosby to provide a connecting service into it. But there was also almost a connection in two places with the Liverpool tramway system, whose trams maroon in the days that we're talking about here. For those of you who haven't heard of the Liverpool Overhead Railway or seen pictures of it, there's an example from a very, very well-known poster that shows it alongside the docks. Charles Box was the son of the general manager of the railway, and there's a couple of editions of that book out. But the tramway, it's our old friend Norman Forbes again. He wrote the definitive history of it. So a few pictures of the Waterloo and Great Crosby tramway. Fleet of 16 cars built in Preston. And there's one at the Seaforth terminus, and you can see the overhead railway structure on the right-hand side. That one is quite an unusual shot from the other angles. That's taken from the elevated electric railway, looking down onto the tramway, which would then, if that tram is in service, it would then go from there, turn left, and head up to Crosby. Sort of straight run up what is still the main road today, and significant bits of which are relatively unchanged. 5 lamps is that road junction. Unfortunately, that rather pleasant lamp standard has gone, but having driven through there just a couple of days ago, there's a modern 5 lamps. So I don't know whether the name is still used for that particular road junction. This road junction here at South Road, that building is still there. That's a pub called the Liver Pub. You can see car number 4 there. One of the strange things about the tramway is they had very, very high railings and grills on the side, probably higher than any other tram system when they were open top. But most of the fleet, I don't think all of the fleet, but most of the fleet later had top covers fitted. In fact, there's the same location at South Road with car 14 with a top cover, and car 4, you can see the railings very, very clearly on that one. That's at the Crosby terminus. As far as I'm aware, there's no relic of the tramway that survives. I mean, it closed as long ago as 1925. Some of the tram poles survived in Crosby Village until the 70s or 80s. In fact, Jonathan Cadwallader, who's on the call here tonight, he was promised those by the council when they were replaced, but nothing ever happened with that, and those disappeared. There is one historian who thinks there is a tram pole somewhere, but another school of thought is it's actually a vent pipe for the sewers, but it's from that same sort of era in cast iron. So the final tramway system to look at, Liverpool, which is totally different to everything else that we've looked at so far. First of all, it's longer. The system length is longer than all of the other systems put together, and it survived a lot later. survived post Second World War and didn't close until 1957, and was one of the 4 or 5 biggest tramway systems in Britain at its heyday. It fanned out from the city centre in all directions up to the city boundary and beyond, with a lot of reserved track. So the dotted sections of line on John Gillam's map there signify where there was normally a reservation in the centre of the road, but some roadside running there as well. So you can see after you got out of the immediate city centre and the inner suburbs, you got into these long, fast grass tracks, largely out into the suburbs, a very modern light rail system. Quite a lot has been written about the Liverpool tramway system. Bruce Morn and another contributor to OTA, John Horn, wrote this wonderful 5-volume set of books on Liverpool transport. They were quite expensive when they came out. It's a sign of the times that you can probably get them quite cheaply second-hand. I think the last one came out about 35 years ago now, but certainly the later volumes are quite widely available. And some other authors a couple of years ago jumped on the bandwagon as well. I've got to say, Martin did probably 90% of the writing of the book from his own memory. And in spite of my protestations, he insisted my name was on the front for the other 10%. And pulling the book together, but that book is still available through the LRTA. Another Francis Frith picture there. This time Lime Street, so the railway station, still the main focus of Liverpool's railway system on the right-hand side, and the neoclassical St George's Hall on the left-hand side, with a selection of horse trams going off in various different directions. From the Lime Street terminus. The electric trams started in I'm sorry, I'm just going to go to my note to 1898. And for a very short time, they only stayed in service for about 2 years. Some German built motor cars and trailers. I think there was it 15 of each, but they only ran for a couple of years before they started buying more traditional double-deck trams, which were the basis of the system as it expanded. A number of pictures here. Several of these are postcards. I think all of these come from Bruce Morn's collection, either Francis Frith or other postcard firms. Most of the trams from this sort of era, so we're talking around about the turn of the century, were built as open top, but very, very quickly acquired top covers. Some of them, in fact, I think might have been built as open top, but had the top cover then fitted before they actually entered service. But a very, very busy commercial centre of Liverpool, with a lot of horse-drawn traffic going to and from the markets and to and from the docks. Liverpool was and is the busiest port on the west coast of Great Britain, and everybody who says, well, the port is nothing like it was in its heyday, just remember all those ships. I did used to point out to my students, they actually carry 10 times the amount of cargo now than they did in the 1950s, but with a far smaller number of ships and a much smaller workforce. So a few views in the city centre. That's Church Street with the town hall in the background. The other end, sorry, not Castle Street, not Church Street. That's the other end of Castle Street. Town hall in the background there. Out in one of the termini before they started extending beyond there with the grass tracks. And one of the things that Liverpool was not quite unique for, but for a period of time, 1908 to 1923, it had first-class trams. So although the electric tramway livery was dark red, they had this fleet of light cream or white cars that ran on some of the routes that charged a premium fare for first-class journeys. But they finished in 1923. They also had an illuminated tram that not only ran in Liverpool, but as you can see there, it's actually got the name Wigan on the side, because what they were able to do, because of the connectivity between the tramway systems, it used to go and visit other systems to advertise Liverpool as a place to come and do your shopping or Christmas shopping. And it was a very popular tram, this apparently at the time, and at times of celebration, coronation, very topically, and things like that, there was always a big clamour for this tram to appear. But there were some events it didn't appear at, and eventually it was broken up rather quietly. And it's a shame in some respects it didn't survive in its entirety. The hub of the Liverpool tram system was Pier Head, where the transatlantic liners used to go from, in front of these three buildings dating from the early years of the 20th century. But the tramway from 1921 onwards terminated on three loops, north, centre and south loops, gradually reduced in the 1950s as the tramway went into decline. So you can see on the map there the three loops on the left-hand side, and quite a dense city centre network in its heyday, until it started to retract after the Second World War. But in the 1930s, and in fact even to the 1940s, there were extensions being built, and the city engineers deliberately built the roads in this sort of style, with central reservation for the tramways and road traffic either side of it. And if you know where to look, you can still recognise where some of these central reservations used to be, although the trams have been gone for over 60 years. The tram fleet, mostly four-wheel cars up until the end of the 1920s, but then a programme of modernising. 757 was a unique single-decker, and it was built when there was thought of putting trams underground in the inner suburbs in Liverpool and even in the Mersey Tunnel. So there it is an artist's illustration of, it actually shows double-deck trams going under there. That never happened, and the tram was scrapped. But from the 1930s onwards, a series of modern bogie cars, these were from 31 and 32, built in the city's own workshops, and these lasted until almost the end of the system. A couple of other classes there, 772 was a livery change. The livery changed from dark red and cream to green and cream, or green and white. And so the trams on the left were actually the original green goddesses. You often hear people talk about Liverpool trams collectively being known as green goddesses, but really it was that batch of 12 cars from 1933 that were the original green goddesses. 795 on the right was one of the cabin cars from 1933-4. And those who know their London trams, it's got a family look to LCC number 1, which they're just in the process of finishing off the restoration of at Christchurch. 821 is one of a Marks bogie car. They in Liverpool, they used to often name them after their general managers. So Marks was a general manager, and these were the follow-up cars to those. But then the final trams were these familiar looking streamline ones that very much typified Liverpool towards the end of the system, built in their own works in Liverpool. Bogie cars, bogie streamliner cars, first of all, there were 163 of those, and then four-wheel cars. So right at the end of the tramway construction, 100 of these four-wheel streamline cars were built. Oddly, although there were 100 of these, the first ones were scrapped before the last ones were built, so there were never 100 in service. The very last tram was number 300, and it's one of these legends that there is no photograph known to exist of those. When Martin and I were researching the book, we were given a collection of photographs and newspaper cuttings by the family of Leo Quinn, who we tried to get in touch with, but he sadly died in 2019. But his family passed the book to us, and piecing one or two things together, we think we finally got to the end of the story about number 300. It was built in 1942, but during the Second World War became defective and was parked up. It was repaired in late 1946. It went back into service then, but was involved in an accident in January 1947. And if only the press photographer had photographed 300 rather than what we think is number 293, we would have finally found a picture of the tram. But that was the accident, and number 300 was one of the 3 trams that was featured there. While it was waiting for repair, it went to Green Lane Depot, where there was a very serious fire in 1947, and it was totally destroyed. So the great kind of holy grail of Liverpool tram enthusiasts is finding a picture of number 300. Liverpool, because of its strategic importance as a port, was quite badly damaged by bombing during the Second World War. The tramway had already been in a slightly parlous state in the late 1930s, but the decision was made fairly quickly in 1946-47 to abandon the trams, starting with route number 26, the Shield Road Circular, and these were abandoned 12th of June 1948. We've seen that map before, but that was what it looked like on the last day of the Shield Road Circular. And that line, if you look at the box city centre, which I've excluded from this map because it's just so dense, but the line with a little bit of a dogleg in the middle going north-south, that was the Shield Road Circular. So you can see on this first phase that disappeared, and the Litherland and Seaforth routes. Then Aintree and Fazakerley went, a few other bits as well. By 1954, all the southern routes had gone. Gradual whittling away of the 1930s grass tracks then took place. Further whittling away of the tracks there until 1956, when you were left with just the Kirby and those lines out to the east of the city. Kirby lines went in 56, and the last 2 routes went in 57, and you were left with no trams at all. Because of where it is, OTA, a lot of its sort of core collections of photographers who were able to get round the Liverpool system. So it's a very, very well photographed system. 544 was a bit of a celebrity. It lasted until 1949, but it was new in 1910 with these open balconies on it. It was one that the enthusiasts at the time chased round and to try and get their last trips on, but finally withdrawn in 49. But the roof was known as a Bellamy with sliding panels, and there's a couple of others on the dump at the works. Still quite a lot of these around post-war, early 4-wheel cars, traditional design 4-wheel cars with handbrakes. So there were still several hundred of these in the 1940s, but went in the early 1950s. That one actually survived until 1958. It's such a shame that something like that couldn't have been preserved. But that was one that was converted after withdrawal into a snowplow, and was still around, as you can see, to be photographed in colour. I think that picture dates from 56, but it was still around till 58. 747 was one of a batch of four-wheelers from the 1920s that lasted until 1952. Which were, I think, were air brake rather than hand braked. A couple of other interesting things on that picture. Notice the steam wagon, which were quite a familiar sight around Liverpool up until about 1960, really. And also some of those poles on the turning loop in the background, which we'll see in a minute. 810, these lasted until this particular car lasted until 52. The last ones of this sort of design, these big bogey cars, lasted until 1955, after which time the whole system was the streamlined design, both the bogey cars and the four-wheelers. That's quite a well-known Alan Clayton picture at a street called Below Street in the south of the city. And you can see there, even by this time, we think this is the last day of service in 8th of September 51. But even then, a lot of the buildings boarded up and derelict. John McCann photograph of the 29 along West Derby Road. Phil Tapp photograph of one of the Kirby routes where it's running here as a roadside reservation rather than down the centre of the road. And the road itself is the East Lancashire Road, which purportedly is the first major intercity new road in Britain. It was built in the 1920s to connect Liverpool and Manchester. A few colour pictures from that sort of era. We've got a series of pictures from Ray de Groot. I was talking to Roberto at the beginning about Ray. Fascinating story with Ray. He came over to the British Isles in 1955 armed with about 25 rolls of film, which he ran off visiting every tramway, a lot of electric railways and trolleybus systems. But over time, all his pictures deteriorated and he very nearly threw them away. But through OTA, we've managed to rescue them. So it's amazing what Photoshop will do. And these, Ray got around a lot of places in colour that a lot of people, British enthusiasts, never did. There's a lot of pictures taken in colour at the end of the Liverpool tram system in the last few years, but Ray was just that few years earlier. Number 40 was another one of the last few routes. That's out at Knotty Ash. And the 6, that's another Ray de Groot photograph, the 6 and the 6A, with the other routes the last right until the end. And we've mentioned Norman Forbes' name a couple of times. There he is leaning on a lamppost at the corner of the street, as the song goes, at Broad Green at terminus the 6A. Edge Lane, a major thoroughfare into the city with dual track and sidings for various factories, biscuits, toys. So at shift change time, a massive requirement for trams. And in the last few weeks of the tramway, car 293 was painted in reverse livery, almost like the first class tram colours, but it was relieved in green rather than in maroon, which I think the first class trams were. But it ran for the last week or 10 days in that livery. And then the ceremonial end, 14th September 57, a parade of trams through Liverpool. Leo Quinn, who I showed the newspaper cutting of before, we've also from him got, his family have passed on plate glass negatives from the official press photographs. So that's what that photograph has come from. So again, more plate glass that in most cases would have been thrown out, but somehow Leo got the hold of these, and we've preserved those at OTA. That picture I'd not seen before, but I thank Rob Jones for that one of the German cars, or in fact I think there's 2 of the German cars. They're out as a caravan in North Wales, which I don't know anything about, but some of those did survive for a while. Most Liverpool trams were scrapped, but the lower saloon of 762 was a shed as a bowling green out in Newsham Park in Liverpool. 46 trams were sold to Glasgow, so they had a second life. I've put the LRTA logo on that one because we at OTA administer the LRTA London group collection of slides on their behalf. So they're still our LRTA property, but we administer them. So that's one of these trams that ran in Liverpool, ran in Glasgow until 1960, and then Glasgow trams finished 62. I did say we were a photo archive rather than document archive. In fact, these documents are not with OTA, but we have scanned them all. Tony Garn, who would have been, 17 at the time, over the last few years of the trams, he kept a notebook diary recording just about everything. And in fact, they're wonderful documents, not just to do with trams, but his school, working life, sporting life, etc. And so that's his notebook from the very last day. But there's this, again, another legend is that a month or so after the trams finished, 2 trams were moved out onto the tram tracks for some official photographs. And it's another photograph that's never come to light. But Jeff Price, somebody else who's worked with us on at OTA extensively and co-authored with Martin Jenkins the recent Glasgow book, he came across this photograph recently, which he thinks is that photograph being set up. There's 293 at the front and 245 in the background. And he thinks that this was the occasion where the 2 trams were wheeled out into the road, where the overhead still existed. Photographs were taken and then they were moved back in, never to turn a wheel again. But the photograph has still not appeared. 293 was about a year later taken away by road, so there's his disappearing. By which time, the tram poles are there, the overhead had gone. Most of the trams were just scrapped. So there's one, the local Liverpool scrapyard. And some of the last bogie cars were taken up to Kirby, where they were stripped of parts and then unceremoniously burned. But not before some of the enthusiasts managed to get a few souvenirs from them. So there's a lot more souvenirs from the Liverpool tram system than there are from other systems. And in the top right is what is believed to be the only panel surviving off the illuminated car. A few other bits of tramway remains. This is now, until yesterday, I thought this was where horse trams used to run. I was right in that they were horse trams, but the tram was never actually opened at this point. But that is still visible in the Georgian Quarter in Liverpool city centre. So the shadow in the stone sets of where horse tram track was laid, albeit never used. And nearby there is a depot that was converted for tramway use, but never used for that. It had been a horse bus depot, but is now was converted to a tram, a horse tram depot, but never used as that, and was never converted for electric use. This was some horse tram track in the city centre, Queen Square, which survived into the 70s but has now gone. And this was electric tram track on the Kirby extension that survived until about the last 10 years or so. And again, had just been buried under tarmac, gradually worn away, and then appeared. And you do quite often see roadworks going on in Liverpool and piles of tram track like that. This survived until 2020. At the beginning of lockdown, it was still there, but while nobody was looking during lockdown, they converted it into a cycle path again on the Kirby extension. But most of the reservations in Liverpool, the tram was just lifted and disposed of. There used to be a few things like this where you saw a shadow of the tram track and the tram poles. Those have now gone as well. And you'd never think there that this was a central reservation tramway. This one would have closed in 1953. Ironically, there you've got an electric bus. And this was used on the very last day of the tramway in 1957. And there you've got electric scooters. So there's still electric traction about, but just not with the overhead wires. There's another abandoned tramway. This is right in the middle of the city centre with the Royal Albert Dock in the background. Difference here is the tramway was never built. Liverpool or Merseyside managed to spend nearly £100 million on not building a tramway. So design, consultancy, moving services, but the tramway was never actually built. But there's the gap where it would have run between the bus station and the hotel. And when the bus station was open, there was even a sign which purportedly said "No trams," beware of trams. I should have been a bit cheeky there and climbed up and peeled off that tape, but I was too well behaved for that, and the sign disappeared very quickly. And there wasn't just the one idea for a tram in Liverpool, but there were two trams. There was the, if you like, the official one from the council, but there was also a private sector one by a different company. That one came to nothing. This is the tram on test in Birkenhead, and it's an associated company of companies who have also failed to build trams in London, Galway and Edinburgh, and they've been working at the one in Preston for about 20 years, and there's no sign of that one taking place either. Lot of tramway rosettes over the around the city centre, including this one where you've got two on opposite sides of the road, where there would have been a span wire in between them connecting the two sides of the road and the tram overhead suspended from those. And that's one that's recently been spotted out in the Anfield district of Liverpool, which closed the last tram run down there in 1947. Sorry, 1948. And that's the road with the Anfield football ground in the background. But the reason I put that one is, if you notice, it's the number 26 Shield Road Circular, which even 75 nearly years on is still the same route number and still the right description. Remember the picture with the steam lorry? And I said, look at the tram poles. For some reason, one of those tram poles still survives. Doesn't do anything, but it's still there. There were some tram depots, but all of those have subsequently been demolished in various places. Across the road from Walton Depot, there was a pub called the Tramway. The pub was closed, but the building survives as a shop. Dingle Depot had that rather nice mosaic, which again, one of the legends is that somebody tried to preserve that, but because it was a mosaic, it broke up into about 500 different pieces. So perhaps somebody has got a 500-piece jigsaw, and one day we'll build that. On the site of that, there's houses, but with a throwback to the tramway, you've got Mallins, who was a general manager, and Maley and Taunton, of course, who built trucks. So somebody's got some idea of their tramway history. And nearby, you've got Tramway Road, where there was a horse tram depot, but the depot has long since gone. And Edge Lane Works, where the trams were built and buses were serviced, that's gone as well. That was demolished in 1997, but had tram track in right until the very end. I've got one final bit to go through about heritage. I realise I'm overrunning a little bit, but if Roberto is okay, I've got a little bit more on this just to quickly run through it, if people are okay with that.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Again, I've got to thank Rob Jones for this section. Largely because he does a full talk on tramcar restoration, and of course the thing with Rob is he doesn't just talk about tramway preservation, he actually does it. He's getting his hands dirty and actually rebuilding the trams. So that was his talk, 75 years of tramcar restoration on Merseyside. It doesn't sound very boring, and when Rob delivers it with his style, I've never heard Rob do a boring talk. I don't think he could do if he tried. So I disagree with him on that one, but I do agree that what's happened in Merseyside tramcar wise has been quite remarkable. It didn't get off to a very good start. These two cars were bought out of service in 1951, but scrapped in 1954. That they weren't actually vandalized, but they just were neglected. And the single decker is one of the original trailers from 1898, and 558 is one of the Bellamy cars. We already mentioned 293 was preserved. Well, that's hardly any better in some respects. Shipped over to Seashore in America, spent quite a lot of time outside. It's supposedly undercover now, but has deteriorated very, very badly. I don't think it's ever run in America. Occasionally people say, can't it be brought back to Liverpool? But I don't think that would be a sensible idea with resources. 245 was put along to one side by Liverpool City. The story there allegedly is that it was going to go into the City Museum, but they didn't build the door big enough to get it in. So it sat in storage for many, many years. Again, deteriorated, not perhaps quite so badly as some others, because it was undercover for most of the time, but for a long, long time, nothing ever happened to that one. The Glasgow trams, the ex-Liverpool trams in Glasgow went towards the end. There was a tour organised by students at Liverpool University, and allied with that was a plan to preserve a tram. In fact, it had gone back earlier than that. That newspaper cutting from Leo Quinn is 1958, and it's the news story about the tram enthusiasts at Liverpool University looking to preserve a tram. You might recognise that 19-year-old pipe smoker as being somebody whose name has come into the talk a few times during this evening. 869, as it was in Liverpool, 1055 in Glasgow, started off having a bit of a checkered history, moved from Glasgow to Leeds to Crouch to Liverpool, where it was restored, then moved back to Crouch, where a lot more restoration was needed, but is now, since I think 1992 is when that was finished, and it's one of the most popular trams now running at Crouch. The University Transport Society morphed into the Merseyside Tramway Preservation Society, and really that was the basis of Rob's talk, and that they were shunted round from one place to another. Here they were at I think called the Large Objects Store in Liverpool city centre, and there were other organisations involved as well. The Wallasey Tramcar Preservation Group rescued one of those tram bodies that we saw earlier on, Wallasey tram bodies from North Wales, number 52. You can see sitting inside there Alan Clayton, having a ride on a Wallasey tram for the first time in what, probably about 35 years since he was a teenager. And that was tram number 52. Sadly, tram number 52 was brought back to Merseyside and set fire to. So that one disappeared, although the Crown Board does survive in a private collection. So attention was turned to another one of the bodies, and that was number 78 that we saw in service before. And from that shed, the tram has been built. So that's what it looked like a few weeks ago. This was the event to mark the 103rd anniversary of the bus service. And just to show how all these things are interconnected, the two people behind preserving that bus were Alan Clayton and Cedric Greenwood. Alan, I think Alan had the enthusiasm, but Cedric actually bought it, but has subsequently sold it to the local museum. A Liverpool horse car came out of somebody's garden and has been restored. There's quite a story about this one, but it was in a builder's yard in Southport, thought to be a Birkdale car, which it was, but when the paint was stripped down, it was clear it was one they'd bought second-hand from Birkenhead. So that's now been restored as a Birkenhead car and built locally in the town. Birkenhead 20, something similar, rescued from as a fisherman's hut, and now runs on the Heritage Tramway in Birkenhead. And the bowling green 762, that bowling green shelter, that's now been fully restored and running on the Birkenhead Tramway. That's a story in itself, the Birkenhead Tramway, but that was the site of it and the building they initially used. It runs for probably a kilometre and a half or so at its full extent, although sadly the bit down to Woodside hasn't operated other than a couple of weeks, hasn't operated for about 4 years, and currently operation of the tramway is suspended, which is a bit sad. To start it off, the council bought 2 trams from Hong Kong, Hong Kong style bodies, but on 4 foot 8.5 inch trucks, and this was them being delivered to Birkenhead, and that was one on that very, very short interregnum where the trams started running in Birkenhead after lockdown. But then because of the condition of the track, they were cut back to the main part of the dock road. So this piece of tram track in front of me hasn't seen service for about 4 years, other than the short 2-week period in 2001. A Lisbon car is there as well. It had come over to Seaton. A British enthusiast had bought it, passed it on to Wirral. That's now fully restored. And currently they're working on a Warrington tram, which is down at the museum in Birkenhead. The lower deck of it was found in Warrington, but probably about 40 years ago. But the group in Birkenhead are now well on with it, and in fact, almost hot off the press. That's a recent picture off the MTPS website to show what the tram is like now. So hopefully not too long before that is up and running and carrying passengers in Birkenhead. And 245, having languished around for 40 years or so, that was entrusted to the MTPS as well. Took them about 10 years to restore it, but they have done, and that's now running as and when the tramway opens. And in fact, that picture of it was on the very first day, slightly ironically, with 2 of the buses that replaced the trams in the 1950s. And 2 other trams at Birkenhead, 2 Douglas horse cars, both of them built in Birkenhead. Hadn't been used since the 1970s. It ended up being stored in the open in Derby on the Isle of Man, but those have been transported to Birkenhead now undercover, and cosmetic restoration work is taking place on those. There's even a Blackpool tram in Birkenhead. 626 is decaying away in Birkenhead docks. I did ask somebody the question yesterday, what's the future for it? Nobody knows. It supposedly is owned by the people who own the port on both sides of the Mersey these days, as part of their heritage proposal, but it's just sat there for several years. Looks as if it's got broken windows now, so I think that might quietly disappear. And one final one in terms of the heritage is Chester number 4, which we saw before in Harry Dibdin's back garden. After Harry died, which was in 1987, the house and the site was cleared. The tram went to some people in North Wales and reportedly had fallen apart and had sort of disappeared off the scene. Somebody asked me the question a few years ago, whatever happened to Chester 4? I relayed the question to Rob Jones a few months later, and on a visit round to his house, and he took me into his garage where there were a few bits of wood, and I've got to quote Rob here directly, because he said there's enough tram DNA here to build a tram. I'm not sure whether I believed him really, but anyway, that's what a tram body looks like, flat packed on a trailer. and that was a recent picture from Rob in a talk he was giving on Chester number 4. So that one is well on the way to looking like a restored tram. So just a few concluding comments. Go to the MTPS to see what they're up to, and particularly if you wanted to make a donation to them, go to Chester Tram 4 on Facebook if you want to follow the story of what Rob is doing with the Chester Tram. Those books are in print, and they all help tramway or photograph preservation, perhaps rather than tramway. As I say, all the other books are out of print, but those 3 are still available. We were working with Roberto on the Northern Italy volume of those 2. Bit of a standstill at the moment, but we do hope to resurrect that project in probably within the next year or so, all being well. That book, I know it's not a tramway one, but that one is due out hopefully in the autumn. Cover might look a little bit different, but we've been working on that one, and we hope to do that tramway one as well. We're waiting for the final go ahead, but Barcelona, Mallorca and Valencia will be the first one of 3 books on Spain, largely using the photographs of Ray de Groot. Have a look at OTA on its web and on Facebook. Thanks to all those people who've contributed to OTA, and without the foresight that they've had either to pass their collections to OTA or we've managed to rescue them, you wouldn't have been seeing half the pictures that you saw here tonight. And thanks to the MTPS for all the work they do, and particularly being able to recreate scenes like that in the streets in Birkenhead. As I say, it's not running at the moment, but hopefully before long that will start to run. So thank you very much, and I'm sorry I've overrun a little bit there, but I'll hand back to Roberto.